Tommy, how are you doing today?
Doing well, thanks. How are you?
Doing great. Well, Tommy, I wanted to just jump straight into it. I found your work actually. I'm a big fan of the great books. And I saw, you had started this project where you're reading through all the great books yourself, kind of like in an autodidact fashion.
hmm
Um, how did you get started on this journey? I think it's such a cool project. And yeah, what initially attracted you and made you think this was a good idea?
Yeah, so I guess there's two things. The kind of immediate cause was that there was a global pandemic, uh,
That's great.
and there's an extent to which I was a great indoorsman, and all my hobbies were actually very quarantine friendly in the sense that they didn't require a lot.
Can you
Um,
say that again? The great endorsement. I love
uh,
that.
yeah.
I love
Well,
that
just
term.
I think it's originally my girlfriend's, where she we started dating, and she was like, "Wow, you are so self-contained,"
That's
which
good.
I think is a compliment, but who's to
Great for
say?
pandemics. Great for pandemics.
Exactly. Yeah, pandemic friendly hobbies. Yeah, and so other people were doing their sourdough starters or their Instagram ads or whatever, and I was like, well, I should have some project. I should be doing something. Have something to show for myself. That there was the early part of the pandemic in kind of March or April where people were like, oh yeah, Isaac Newton, wrote this thing in the middle of the, Black Plague of London or something. And it's like, oh, well, if he's going to do something, may as well, have something to show for myself,
Right.
especially because, I was super lucky in the sense of, Lambda School, the company I work for, is this online education program. And so we just went remote and, I stayed working. And so there's an extent to which, uh, a lot or kind of most people had a much more disruptive pandemic experience than I did. But so I was kind of looking around, thinking what sort of projects I wanted to do. And I graduated from the journalism school at NYU, a couple years ago. And journalism was a super vocational major, very kind of, I mean,
Gotcha.
naturally kind of a very um, hands-on major in the sense that we had a couple of kind of theory classes, but it was mostly how to be a journalist. And there's an extent to which I kind of everything I know to the extent that I know anything about journalism today, and to the extent that I can write anything that comes from being editor at the student newspaper, as much as it did whatever journalism classes I
Right.
took. And so super kind of hands-on, super vocationally based majors, and I kind of realized that I didn't have the kind of traditional college experience that I saw in movies and things and read about in well, I don't know if Donna Tartt is a traditional college experience. It's like a murder mystery, but NYU of course is in and of the city, and so it's a very
Right.
kind of city-based college or whatever. But all this to say that I was like, oh, I never actually did the going deep on old things that kind of so many college students did. To the extent that I was staying up late arguing with people in my dorm room, it was over kind of journalism things or over politics or stuff that was happening at the time more than it was like, what did Cicero say about the role of the polity. And so I had read probably a couple of years ago at this stage, I had read a book called Investing: The Last Liberal Art, by a
Oh,
guy called
interesting.
Robert Hagstrom. And he basically makes the claim that you should know a lot about or a little about a lot of things, and he specifically cites Charlie Munger and this kind of mental model discussion and being able to pull from the best of every industry. But to make a long story short, he referenced the Great Books program at St. John's College, which is a university in Annapolis that doesn't kind of today's college students are sort of kind of handed a menu of what they want to study, and like mixing and matching classes from all different areas. St. John's has none of that in the sense that over in the St. John's you read, I think it's 150 books over the 4 years. Everyone reads the same books in the same order, and so if you are a freshman talking to a junior, they read the same books you are 2 years ago, and so there's from people who've told me about it, there's this remarkable cohesion on campus where everyone has done the same things. And there are no kind of classes or lectures to speak of, in the sense that they
Gotcha.
literally spend their entire time reading these books. And so, in pandemic, I basically decided, I was like, okay, well, the ship has sailed on me being a St. John's undergrad, but there's no reason I can't do this solo. And so I basically uh, started the project, and did what I sort of do sometimes, which is like to keep me not so much to keep me honest, but to keep me engaged, or to like
Yeah.
as a kind of pre-commit, as it were. I
Right.
basically just kind of tweeted that I was doing this, or wrote a blog post that I was doing it, and there was far more kind of interest than I was expecting, in the sense that it turns out a lot of people kind of A, are interested in reading these old books, but B, are interested in this kind of discussion as to why someone would do it, or kind of what benefit there is. And I
Gotcha.
guess this kind of gets back to this whole, discussion around colleges these days, which is kind of very much in vogue.
Right. Yeah, no, that's a great point, right? And I'm curious, how far have you gotten so far in the project? And have you gotten any big takeaways? Like, I guess like there's the enjoyment part of it, there's the utility part of it, there's a lot of factors at play. There's learning about from things from the past. What has been the most valuable thing so far?
It's probably the extent to which there are no great books. There's only one big conversation. In
Gotcha.
in the sense that everything is kind of responding to something else. And I'm like fairly early in the project. Maybe we should be doing this podcast in like 4 years' time or something.
Right.
But
We'll come back.
exactly, there's an extent to which one, these people and these ideas are responding to one another, and kind of sometimes explicitly, sometimes implicitly. So to give an example, right now, I'm reading Dante's Inferno, and Inferno is essentially Dante walking through hell, and the kind of seven circles of hell, or whatever. We get that from Dante. That's a kind of a reference to Dante. Um, and he as his guide has Virgil, the author of the Aeneid, this kind of very famous, I guess, Roman classic that is talks about the founding of Rome, and became kind of central to, um, well, Mussolini in like the
Right.
1920s and 30s, kind of held it up as an example of like, this is the great Roman Empire or whatever. Um, and so there's an extent to which everyone's kind of talking to each other, and that Dante references Virgil and references a ton of other writers. But kind of more than that, there's almost a sense of comfort where the things that they're arguing about um, are the same things that we're arguing about today. And I think literature has, and especially kind of good literature, great literature, has this quality about it that it feels kind of immediately familiar, where if you look at today, where this kind of bowling alone phenomenon of okay, kind of religiosity is declining, membership of random social things like unions or bowling clubs, I think it was his example, are declining. What does it mean to be part of a community? What does it mean to live a good life? This is literally what Dante is feeling when he kind of stumbles on the entrance to hell, where he's like, I was in a
Oh, that's
dark
very
wood.
interesting.
Yeah, he's like, I was in a dark wood and my life was kind of all over the place, and I was feeling lost. And some things happened, and then I entered hell, and I'm only halfway through the Inferno, so I don't have the key takeaways. But essentially, this is him trying to work out, how do I live a good life? What because he's explicitly religious, kind of like, what does God want? What does it mean to live in accordance to good beliefs and everything? But kind of zooming out, or to give a slightly more contemporary example, one of the reasons I loved Hamilton, I don't know if you saw it,
Yeah, it's
but
great.
the musical. But think of the three conflicts in Hamilton, which is immigrants, good or bad? Question mark. Um, State versus federal rights, like the entire second
Yeah.
act is Jefferson v. Hamilton. And three, also in the second act, like how much should we be in Britain or France's affairs? I mean, think about it. It's like immigration, question mark, states' rights, question mark, and should we be the world's policeman, question mark. Like, all three of those are like early 2000s debates that Republicans
Right.
and Democrats were having, and kind of very much still to today. And I remember kind of walking out of Hamilton and being like, wow, nothing ever changes. And
Is
that's
there anything
so,
new? Right.
yeah, that's so comforting.
Right. It's like our ancestors have faced very similar challenges, and I do think that's one of the big benefits of reading the great books, right? Is seeing people that have encountered problems that we encounter today, and like seeing how they dealt with them, how they were successful, how they were not successful. Do you think there's an element where the great books are valuable for some kind of like Lindy effect, where they've been around for a long time, they survived, and so they've made it through some filtering process, whereas new works, it's tougher to tell, right?
Yeah, I think it's probably safe that you shouldn't read any books in the last 10 years. Um, because there has to be some, and that there's different factors here in the sense that there's like way more books published
Right.
than kind of ever before. But it's probably safe to say that books have to go through a certain amount of exposure to the real world. And I mean exposure to the field in the sense that if you're, especially I guess in nonfiction, you're putting something forward, you're adding something to the canon. Robert Hagstrom wrote this book on investing, and presumably made some claims about investing, and people who know much more about investing than I do probably had opinions on those. And it's like, okay, well, let's let society digest this book a little bit, and see if it comes to the bottom or to the top. And so I guess to the extent that life is short and there are many many books, and you presumably want to be reading the best things that you can,
Right.
you know, I guess to be safer than sorry, you probably want to avoid new things. And to your point, there is nothing less new than, I think the Iliad and the Odyssey are kind of two of the oldest, certainly in the Western civilization, kind of the oldest stories we have. The Bible, question mark.
Right, right. They're quite old, right? Like, yeah, it's hard to get older than those two. Um, I'm curious, so the great books, they've been declining, like, and there's a lot of debates now, and I think you've written about some of this, about, how much should we be reading these books? And I think some of that sentiment comes from the fact, okay, the West, whatever the West is, has done a lot of good things. It's done a lot of bad things, and this is all mixed up within that canon, right? What do you think about that, and have you thought about that issue much?
Yeah, I guess. Well, there's two kind of separate but related arguments that I see happening. One is which, like, kind of, oh, you should study something useful,
Right.
not the kind of humanities in trouble problem, which is like in one part. And then the second part is this kind of dead white man problem, where kind of so much of the canon, so much of what we're reading, all kind of look alike. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? And there's to the second problem, and I think it is a problem in the sense that I think if we can make the I guess, to take a step back, the canon isn't set in stone in the sense of when we talk about the great books. This is
Right.
kind of a roughly agreed upon list of important things. And so, what is important, what is kind of worth reading? There are people who've put forward lists or kind of suggestions, but I don't think that kind of precludes putting other things on that list. And I think, and even if you kind of look at my list that I've published online, it includes a lot of what we might call kind of the Eastern classics.
Gotcha.
In the sense of I certainly see no reason to study Western literature at the expense of everything else.
Right.
But there's kind of two questions there, which is like, is some Western literature, is some of what we could kind of traditionally call the great books worth studying? And I think the answer is yes. To the conclusion of other things, like, no, not necessarily. But the second thing I'd say to the dead white man problem is, for better for worse, these are the thinkers who influenced what we might call the great people, or the great strongmen of history, or whatever the phrase is. In the sense,
Right.
Thomas Jefferson, classically educated; Winston Churchill, classically educated. And you can dispute both of those people, and people do vociferously. The things that the two people I just mentioned have done or
Right.
did. But there's an extent to which you kind of want to know what they knew, or kind of study what they studied. And I think there's a lot of value in that. Incidentally, Winston Churchill, just completely off topic, I was reading, there's a new biography of him, but I was reading, he was born in like kind of the 1880s and died in 1965, which means he was born literally at the height of the British Empire, and
Watch the whole thing come down.
watch the whole thing go down. And
Oh
you
my
know, it's
God.
kind of sad that his funeral in 65 was like the death knell of the British Empire, because it's like, well, who's left after that?
Right.
Um, and I find that kind of, life has a way of being weirdly poetic sometimes.
It does. That's quite interesting. Um, so on your first point, you talked about the utility of kind of reading the great books. There's an old Scott Alexander post about, and it's about Harvard admissions rates over
Mhm.
time. And so Harvard, back in the 1800s and even the early, let's see, 1900s as well, up until recently, fairly recent, like post World War II, it was not very competitive at all. It's like
Mhm.
you would take an interest exam and you could pretty much come. Like if you could pay the fee, it was very minimal. You could come. And there, I get the feeling there was not a big wage premium to having a college degree. And over time, that wage premium, I think, has increased. Do you think that plays to part of why it's become something where everyone needs a college degree to succeed, and you're going for utility instead of like, well, I'm just really interested in these things, and there aren't that many people that are interested, so I'm just going to go study it. Do you think that feeds into why the great books have and humanities as a whole have gotten kind of there's declining interest?
Yeah, and the kind of decline of the humanities kind of, I think, has a lot of people nervous, myself included, in that I don't know what the optimal number of classics
Right.
departments is, but in a sort of kind of Chesterton's fence sort of sense, I don't love that we're closing them down. And the big discussion that's happening right now that I've been following is, so Howard University, which is this historically black college,
Probably the
announced that
best
they're,
HBCU, and my father-in-law's dad went to Howard.
oh,
Anyway,
cool.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, he
yeah.
did.
No, a rightly famous university is closing their classics department, ostensibly because of low enrollment. And it's like, okay, what happens when the largest and arguably kind of most prestigious HBCU, closes down their classics department? There's kind of all these stories about Douglas, Frederick Douglass, kind of studying these classic thinkers, and it becoming kind of a formative
Okay,
experience
interesting.
for him. Yeah, and so I mean, there's, well, we're talking about kind of 17 different problems. One of which, as you say,
Right.
is kind of great inflation, and the you know a bachelor's degree being almost kind of table stakes for a lot of jobs. And I think the benefit of the great books and the fact that there's no kind of price of admission or whatever, where you can get these for kind of a couple
Right.
cents, is that it's the first step to seeing education as something that happens kind of out of the bounds of a university. In the sense of, we seem to have decided that learning is something you do for the first 22 years of your life, and then you're
And
kind
then
of
you're done.
off on your own. Yeah, and this is fundamentally not true, both because, as the great book show, you can kind of just do it on your own or do it in small groups or whatever, but also in the sense that I think something like 75% of people are not working in the industry that they went to college for. I think it's like 27% are, and so
Right.
myself included. And so it's an extent to which college is important, and you can be a very enjoyable formative experience. But the great books, the way that I've started thinking about it is, the great books is this sort of like Large Hadron Collider, but for ideas, in the sense of you're kind of picking and choosing from a ton of different areas, and kind of mashing stuff together, where kind of you literally are studying kind of geography, theology, physics, literature, science, history,
Everything.
biology, everything. Yeah. And so if we can kind of extricate learning from the university system, and like at my day job at Lambda, this is what we're doing. We're saying you can change your career without having to go to a 2 or a 4 year institution.
Right.
And which is not to say I think colleges are going to go away or should go away. I'm asked this in context of Lambda School, where it's like, well, should I go to college or go to Lambda School? I'm like, well, they're two very different projects,
Right.
and suitable for kind of two very different people, or two very different kind of types of people. I'm just in favor of more choice, in the sense of being able to choose A over B. And so in a similar vein, I think if we can kind of bring learning out of traditional classroom environments, I think that would be a really good thing. But that, of course, lends the question where it's like, how do you do academia outside of academia? In the sense of, yeah, you
Right.
can read these great books, but people have kind of rightly said when I tell them about the project or on Twitter or something, they're like, yeah, but like, isn't the whole benefit of St. John's that they get together in these small discussion groups? What is the benefit of reading them on your own? Which I think is super valuable, or like a very good question. And so then I think the question becomes, okay, if we kind of move learning outside of the university system, it's like, okay, well, let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater. Like, how do we take the best parts?
Right. I really like that. And I do wonder how much of the, credentialism, requiring it has made knowledge and learning, everyone, like, because it's so focused on, get the degree to get you money, it's obfuscated the fact that, learning is a good in itself, right? Like, in general, it's a good thing to be learned and consume these ideas and see what other people have thought before you.
Yeah, no, and then there's a whole thing of like, well, the robots are gonna, work and sleep, to the extent that robots need to sleep. But like, what in what ways are we different? And Zena Hitz, who's a tutor at St. John's, wrote a really good book about this. I think it came out last year, called Lost in Thought. And the subtitle is The Hidden Pleasures of an Intellectual Life, basically saying that as a byproduct, your career may benefit from learning things, but fundamentally the fundamentally taking the time to learn things creates this inner space, and in that inner space is where reflection happens, is where growth happens, and so just kind of creating that space and kind of inhabiting it every now and again has benefits outside of getting kind of like, oh, you're gonna get a performance review and a raise after this.
Right, right. And it also seems like even just the ability to see that, like, kind of like you mentioned this earlier, it's like most of the problems you encounter in your life, so one of these authors has encountered this and like written a lot on it, and I guarantee you, he or she is much smarter than you are and has put a lot of time into and it's survived this process, right? And so there's a lot of wisdom to be gained from doing this.
Yeah, and I think that there are some practical benefits, and I don't want to claim that it is just kind of navel gazing. One of the ones that I keep coming back to is you just get so much experience, or so much exposure to people articulating their ideas, both in the nonfiction sense, in the sense of like these people are laying out their arguments, but also you get the one that I keep coming back to is leadership, and
Interesting.
The entire the entire great conversation or whatever is essentially a study in leadership, in the sense of like the Iliad starts off with just literally kind of fundamentally a dude and his manager fighting it out over credit and like literally a performance review.
Right.
And so you get these kind of studies in leadership. I mean, the Bible is another great example where it's like, all right, you're going to take Abraham and he's going to found a religion and he's going to talk to people, and then there's going to be a covenant with God, and we'll see where it goes from there.
The original startup.
Exactly.
Monotheism.
Is it? Yeah, I was about to say, is that Judaism or Christianity?
That's a great question.
Yeah. And so, to the extent that leadership is predicated on your ability to articulate your position, I think it's really important to study people both in the kind of the nonfiction sense, like I said, but also in fiction. And then just kind of beyond that, I was asked recently, kind of, okay, I don't have, the time that you have or the patience that you have to like go read 125 of them, but like, what should I read that is, kind of really kind of weighty. And I kind of came, I mean, again, 10 books in, and so kind of premature question, but I think Don Quixote might be the single best novel ever written.
Oh, wow.
And it was the first. So, I mean,
there's some benefit there.
Yeah, exactly. Talking about the longevity question, it's like,
Yeah.
it's just stood the test of time. But it's an amazing novel where kind of the premise is, and it's this wonderful quote. I actually do have a copy to hand. I wonder how quickly I can find it. But there's a quote in kind of the first chapter where it's like he read so many books that his brain rotted away, which occupational hazard.
Yes.
but so because his brain has rotted away, he believes he's a knight, this like chivalrous knight of all the stories that he's read, and he basically goes off on adventures, and people sort of play into it, or circumstances being what they are, and throughout the entire novel, you're never sure whether Don Quixote is crazy or everyone else is. And so you can sort of read it as this comic story, this kind of funny story where things happen, and it is kind of genuinely funny. Or it's this like really touching thing where, Don Quixote is literally the last person on earth who believes in chivalry, who believes in people being good, and who believes in, this literally this covenant between, people, and setting up this society. And so it's a book with 17 layers all the way down.
I love that. Well, and you brought up a very enjoyable book, Don Quixote. How much do you think someone like doing a project like you're doing and reading the great books, how much should they push? So, Taleb has this line, and he's quite the nut, but he's like, if you're not enjoying it, don't read it. Like, switch to something else, but, it clearly seems to me there's some cases where it's like we're struggling with some things. Like I really enjoyed Moby Dick, and it was a hard book to get through. And that was an incredibly formative book for my life, but it was difficult to get through. Like I'm not going to lie.
Yeah.
How much should you struggle with a given work before you toss it, or should you struggle?
Well, the thing, and you might only know this if you're like me and going way too deep on this, in the sense of, reading the great books, I've realized that there is this entire debate going on, but both in terms of kind of the people who think about these things for a living, and in terms of like literature professors and English professors, but also, kind of to Zena Hitz's point, there are just so many people who, they're firefighters, they're people in office jobs, they're whatever, and, their day jobs might be somewhat, sometimes be mundane, or sometimes be, not the most fulfilling things in the world, and who are going out and reading these and, literally kind of spending their salaries on books, and, they might be classic books, and, Emily Dickinson, whatever it is, or it might be just, airport mysteries, and there's something kind of really, really nice about that. To your point about what or how much should you push, and kind of this is a debate that happens in the people who are thinking about this every day, but like there are new translations basically once a decade, depending on the book. So Emily Wilson just released a translation of the Odyssey, and it's kind of a much lauded translation, both because it's good, but it's also the first that we know of, at least the first time a woman has translated the Odyssey. And this is kind of important in and of itself, from kind of a representation standpoint, but also important because, translations, you think, okay, it's just the original work, and then it gets translated and that, like, whatever. But there's a lot of editorializing, I think, that goes into translations. And so the example with Emily Wilson and the Odyssey is, and I have one or two other copies somewhere here, but in one version it'll be like, and Odysseus went to his servant and said, blah blah blah, and it's like, oh, that wasn't like a servant in like the P.G. Wodehouse Jeeves sense, like that was a slave. And Emily Wilson kind of canonically uses the word slave for those people, and he this person didn't take so and so as their mistress or their buddy or something, you know what I mean? It's like, oh, they were taken as a slave, and so there's a lot of kind of new lenses you can bring on, you can kind of bring onto these books, and kind of very much not static. Don Quixote, my translation was Edith Grossman, which I think came out in like early 2000. And so, you can go back to 1960 or even earlier, when there were very staid translations, very difficult to get through.
Gotcha.
But, Don Quixote, because of Grossman's translation ethos, or whatever you want to call it, is this eminently readable, very, kind of vernacular, very easy to read book, and even actually this version of Don Quixote has a translation section at the back where like the first two paragraphs or something, they compare like 17 different different translation, you can kind of see what I'm talking about, where it's like, oh, it's not for a given that this thing is actually easy to read. It's like, this was a conscious decision. And so what I say to people is like, classics shouldn't be difficult to read by definition. It's harder than Harry Potter. But it's not, the striving isn't necessarily the point.
Gotcha.
I'm not sure I buy this, you should just throw it out the minute it gets hard, because I think there's like a lot of reward to doing a hard thing and to struggling with something and to sitting with it for a while. But I certainly don't subscribe to this idea that the slog is something like the price of admission.
Right. That I think that's well put, and it does make me wonder. If you're reading something like Shakespeare, and so Shakespeare, it's in English, but there's a lot of words that are not used in the same context. What do you think about that? When you get through those, is it worth trying to find like what is it, No Fear Shakespeare or something? Because we're just going to the plays. What do you feel about that?
Oh yeah, I mean, my version of Shakespeare, I don't have it to hand, but my versions of Shakespeare are like the ones that middle schools and high schools use, where I'm like, I want to appreciate the language and the style, and when, especially when it's written in a different language, and Shakespeare is like basically a different language at this stage. There's a lot of like, oh, in the original Italian, this is really funny because it actually does this or whatever. So you kind of want the original Shakespeare there because it's very well done. But I also want to, and Shakespeare is a good example because fundamentally these are plays, right? These are stories.
Right.
And Shakespeare is trying to be clever and trying to be funny, but it's not some kind of like rhetorical flourish where he's trying to convince you of something.
Yeah.
And so I'm very much there where it's like, this means that they want to have sex. It's
Right.
like,
Okay,
you totally want that sort of like footnote or side note or whatever, where you're not struggling with it so much as you're whatever allows you access into the story and to understand these characters and to understand these plots. And the Shakespeare that I did in high school, there's a ton on the list for year 2, but the Shakespeare that I did in high school was Macbeth. And Macbeth, dripping in irony, and kind of, you watch Macbeth's world sort of unravel because he's like, oh, no man of woman born will ever harm me. And he's like, oh yeah, I'm, invincible. And you watch that kind of fall apart, and you watch him realizing that it's falling apart. And that's what you're reading Shakespeare for. It's not the, or I guess secondarily, I think it's the flowery language, but fundamentally he's a storyteller.
Gotcha. I think that's a really good way to approach it and think about that problem. Tommy, you've been interested in books since you were a little kid, isn't that correct? Maybe I've gotten this from your Twitter, your blog, but
Yeah.
It's been a lifelong pursuit, right?
Yeah. So we grew up in the middle of nowhere in Ireland. There were 2 of us, or 3 of us, my older brothers and I, and we all sort of developed our own interests. The kind of point that I make is that there was no, going out to the street to play with your friends because there was no friends nearby. They were all, 10, 15 miles down the road, and there were no streets to speak of. And so we all got a chance to explore our own interests, and our parents were great because they were very much the sort of people who would push kind of from behind,
That's good.
support our interests. Yeah, I remember Patrick wanted to learn ancient Greek, and so my parents found him a tutor on Saturday mornings at a local Dominican or Franciscan abbey, but like literally,
oh, wow. That's great.
It's like studied ancient Greek with like a monk at an abbey. And so, it wasn't them being like, oh, you have to study a foreign language. It's like Patrick expressed this interest, and they like found a way of supporting it. And so, Patrick and John went into computers, and I kind of followed them in a little bit later, but I fundamentally was like, oh my God, I can like sit in this chair with this book and it's great. And so, I got into kind of reading and writing fairly quickly, and the internet then became this thing that we could use to kind of press our noses up against the rest of the world. I was too young for kind of Amazon and this idea that the Kindle where you could press a button and be reading something five minutes later, but probably for the best in terms of like my credit card bill or something like that. It's exactly. Like, probably thanks me for that.
That's good. Do you think there's something cultural there about, in the United States, there's like intense pressure to, get your kids into, the good high school. Now it's even like get your kids in the good kindergarten in New York City. And it's just like intense competition, and people just, they don't get a chance to explore what they're interested in, right? Like, go read the great books, etc. Like whatever that looks like, go learn Latin if you want to. Do you feel like that was a cultural difference, or is that just like a special case with, your parents had kind of a good insight there?
Yeah, it's a good question. There's a kindergarten near where I am that bills itself as a college prep kindergarten,
Wait.
and I'm kind of like,
I'm sorry. That's just
no, not at, that
that's
was
funny.
entirely my reaction.
Oh
Um,
no.
yeah, and
Oh
so
no.
uh, there's that in America. In that, I haven't got hold of the kindergartens or preschools in Ireland, but I don't think there's that same idea. But two, Patrick's talked about this a good bit. He kind of very famously has advice for people 10 to 20.
Yeah,
So kind of the people you're talking about, where he makes the point that there is going to be strong forces kind of pushing you towards this traditional route of padding your high school resume with extracurriculars and stuff like this.
yeah,
And so we were kind of lucky because we were away from it, kind of insulated from this American high school to college pipeline, by virtue of being in Ireland. But I think that our parents were good at it. And I think this is an Irish thing more generally, where there's just kind of a free range parenting aspect to it, where, as long as you're home by dark,
that's
you know what I
great.
mean? You can kind of do as you wish. And I think there's a lot more, uh, everything at its time, in the sense of, yeah, you should probably worry about college, but probably not till the last like 2 years of, you know what I mean? Like you should
Right.
probably start thinking about it then. But yeah, there isn't the same sense that kind of the things you're doing as a 10 or a 12-year-old are going to then downstream impact you. And so there's an extent to which Patrick, especially, I remember kind of growing up watching him. He went deep on, at various stages, ancient Greek, physics, literature, math, and kind of various branches of science, as well as computer programming, which I guess is arguably what he went into. So there's an extent to which, because the external forces aren't there, naturally you do have a little bit more flexibility or freedom.
That's great. Well, and we've had do you know who Don Braben is by any chance? This is kind of out of left field.
No, 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 no.
He wrote a book, Strike Press just recently released it. It's called Scientific Freedom.
Oh,
Uh,
yeah, yeah, yeah.
yeah, so he's
I,
great. So we had him on the show. He's 85. He's still sharp as a tack.
yep.
He's a physicist. He ran a venture research program at BP. And his whole thought was, the big problem is that we've gotten too much oversight and bureaucracy for scientists now. Used to be you could get this small amount of money, 30K a year, go out, explore whatever you wanted to, right? And, Max Planck spent 20 years on thermodynamics, and he could probably never do that again, right? It's just his weird idea, and he just kept iterating on it. And I do wonder if we lose something when we just, force kids to, go down this one path, and you don't have this kind of freedom to pursue what interests you.
Yeah, and I mean, well, this gets back to, and I'm saying this sort of as someone who made it through to the other side of this, but if we say that 75% of people aren't studying or aren't working in the thing that they studied in college as an undergrad, like, well, why are we worried about what people study in college? And it's probably good to not be completely unmoored and
Right.
what I mean, just like
Exactly.
wasting time. But yeah, there's probably some aspect to, there are some things that matter a lot, and then there are some things that matter much less, where uh if you know what you want to do, it is kind of quote unquote fine not to go to college. But if you can kind of afford to do it and you don't know what you want to do with your life, there are worse ways of spending 4 years than going and
Right.
kind of exploring a bunch of different things. Like, oh, is it this? Is it this? Is this? And this is exactly what I did, where I didn't know what I wanted to do, and I think I changed my major like 8 times in my freshman year. So there's an extent to which that asks 16-year-olds to have a lot of foresight, where it's like, do I know what I want to do with my life?
Right.
But I think it's kind of becoming increasingly less important. That this decision you make when you're 16 or 17, it kind of sets you on this path.
Right. What was there anything about journalism that particularly attracted you? Was there, something you read? I don't know. Was there anything that grabbed you?
Yeah. So I wanted to be a journalist after. So I don't remember. It came out, I think, in 2005 or something. But there was a book, The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, which is a movie with Daniel Craig in 2010 or whatever. But so The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo is this kind of murder mystery thriller where a journalist and a computer hacker solve a mystery. And so of course it's like made for Tommy, where it's like, oh, I like computers, I like journalists.
This is great.
Yeah, it's good. This is great. This is like content written specifically for me. I'm also a huge like thriller or mystery fan.
Awesome.
But so The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, but it was written by a guy called Stieg Larsson, who's the Swedish journalist, and it's almost one of those times where like the truth is better than the story. So Stieg Larsson was a writer for a magazine that kind of he was the basis of the journalist in the novel. But so he wrote for this magazine that covered the alt-right, and
Oh, wow.
the kind of alt-right movement in America came kind of 10 to 15 years after it came in Europe. In the right of this kind of, Europe had these sort of nationalist, anti-immigrant parties and politicians kind of a little bit before America did. Excuse me. And so he basically covered neo-Nazis in Sweden. He covered all of these sorts of things, and it was kind of very inspiring in the sense that he took this part of culture, this part of society, or whatever, and says, you probably don't care about this thing, but here's why you should care about this thing. And that was, to me, kind of a very powerful view of journalism. And so when I was in high school and then later in college, I started thinking, kind of, what is that for me? It's like, I don't know anything about politics. But what I did know was computers, and what I was seeing, and because, so I was in my senior year of high school, literally graduating high school, the month of the Edward Snowden disclosures. And I remember I was doing like my terminal exams and kind of going home and being like, oh my God, what's happening here? And if you remember, it's like there's a whole saga, because it's like, these news things came out, and then it's like, oh, it's this guy in, and he's escaped to Hong Kong, and he's in Hong Kong. Is he going to be arrested there? And it's like, oh, he's disappeared. Oh, now he's in Russia. It literally was like a soap opera that you could tune into. But and I started putting together almost like a worldview that I ended up kind of writing about, and I still have like the first draft of a book on my hard drive that I've yet to like find a publisher for. But basically, kind of what is this thing of like, here is the thing that you don't really know all that much about, but you should care about because it's going to be important.
Right.
And I kind of formulated my theory of this, which is, and again, it was informed by the journalism that I did in college, which was, it's very difficult to keep information secure. And this is true on the interpersonal level, where you have revenge porn, which is kind of the non-consensual sharing of intimate texts and photos, usually of like an ex or something like that. So kind of, and there's so many stories, and I talked to some people in college about this, but there's kind of so many stories online of people who, their first Google result is something like this. And it scuppers job interviews. It makes it very hard to do anything because, of course, everything is online these days. Right. So interpersonally, very difficult to keep things secure. On a company level, very difficult to keep things secure. You see this in terms of like Equifax getting hacked. Ashley Madison, which was this dating app for people who wanted to have affairs, had their membership list leaked.
Not good for their business, I'm sure.
Not good for their business, but also like kind of literally the worst thing. Yeah, it's like, and kind of we kind of chuckle about it, but like people committed suicide over this list leaking. And then so it's true on personal level, it's true on company levels, and it's true on governmental levels in the sense of the Snowden leaks, WikiLeaks. on the company level, there was this story, Sony got hacked by North Korea because Sony was releasing this movie that was critical of the North Korean government. And, the movie was almost canceled, whatever. It did, get digitally released. And, North Korea hacked Sony and released a bunch of emails that showed that they were basically paying male stars or male executives more than they were paying female, which of course, in the context of the discussion on gender equality, was like very damaging for Sony. And so, it's so on every level, it is very difficult to keep information secure. And, either there's kind of one or two outcomes here, one of two, which is the first outcome is like, hey, from like 1995 to 2030, we had a lot of information leaking. No one's social security was private, and like all these texts and images were coming out. It was a wild west of a time, but we managed to batten down the hatches.
Right.
And the second option is just we never managed to figure this out, and just the information that's online is susceptible to leak, which is its own weird little paradigm shift, in the sense of like, what do we do when our social security numbers are bought and sold on the dark web,
Right.
and what does it mean for like the fact that your social is used as identity verification by like literally everyone, and so a long way of answering your question, kind of the thing that I got really interested in was, oh God, computers are going to like upend everything, and it's going to get worse before it gets better. The counter argument to all of that is like, how has your life meaningfully changed since the Equifax leak?
Right.
It's like
it really hasn't changed, right? Like,
yeah,
at least
like
for me, right?
Yeah, I actually can't point to anything that happened. But was there any large scale change after the Snowden leaks? There was a little bit. Public opinion really did seem to shift. But has the NSA's powers really been meaningfully reined in? It doesn't really seem so.
Right. Do you think it's just gotten to be so much that, so much information is released about us, and we're just kind of like attenuated to it? Do you think that's what has generally happened will continue to happen? Or do you think there's a moment where like, oh God, this is like a little too much?
Yeah. I mean, the scale of it means that we haven't, it's very easy to not feel the personal effects. For like that person with the Ashley Madison leak probably really feels it.
Right.
But if you're not, and there's this classic line that privacy activists use where, if you've nothing to hide, you've nothing to worry about, like just fundamentally isn't true, because there's always something. Yeah. And so maybe it's a question of just there's so much information leaking online that we haven't found the thing that like pushes everyone's button. The one that I come back to is, we've had Photoshop for like 25 years, and we still sort of trust images.
That's pretty interesting, isn't it?
Yeah, it's like we still mostly trust images.
Yeah.
And everyone's kind of worried about this from the perspective of like deepfakes, so like fake videos. And there's this famous one of Obama talking, and it turns out that it's a comedian voicing him or something with computer generated imagery. And I find it kind of hard to worry about that, just because it's like, again, like we mostly still trust images, even though Photoshop is real good these days. And so I sort of feel it's like an emperor has no clothes moment, where it's just like, there's going to be something on everyone. I was talking to someone, interviewing them for the book, and they were making the parallel with drug use and American presidents, where it's like, in previous years, it would have been unconscionable for a president to admit to drug use. And then by the time we got to Obama, he was like, yeah, I smoked pot in college. Everyone smoked pot in college.
Right.
And so now it's just not a worry. And so it's like, well, in future, when millennials or Gen Z are like old enough to be running for president, it's going to be like, hey, is this your intimate photo that got leaked online? They're like, yeah, everyone's photos got leaked online. It's
right.
Like, photos aren't private anymore. Yeah. And so maybe that's the end game, where it just kind of doesn't matter.
Right. Where if you have something on everyone, you have nothing on anyone, something like that.
Yeah. I mean, in particular for the photos side of things, I think people are like, public opinion is so against the people who are like leaking the intimate photos that it's almost get some almost like a free pass, where it's like, yeah, that was a really shitty thing to do. Sorry, I shouldn't swear, but it's like that's a really bad thing to do. And so I think it's becoming less. It's being seen as the invasion of trust.
Yeah.
That it is more than it's like, oh well, why are you taking those sorts of pictures? It's like, look,
Right.
people are humans.
Exactly. I've thought about this issue in the context of Neuralink, and when at the point where we're controlling computers with our thoughts, and then thoughts start getting public. Do you think that's crossing a Rubicon, or it's another thing where it's just like, well, everybody's gonna have it out there, and on the margin, maybe there's some bad things that happens, but it's not something really to worry about.
Yeah, I mean the thing with technology that I'm seeing is that we go and then we pull back. So cell phones are a great example of this, where it's okay. Well, when it's like literally a phone, that's great, and it's very convenient to carry around with us, and it's a great new technology. And then it's like, well, we've got these apps, and like, well, everyone's spending way too much time on them, and now there's this kind of cottage industry of what's called a digital detox, where it's like, oh yeah, we're going to be away from our phones, and Apple introduces screen time, where it's like highlighting the apps you spend the most time, and you can shut off access to them after a certain amount of time. And it's almost like this Walden Thoreau moment of like, we invent all this new technology, and then it's like, oh, let's pull back. And of course, for me being Jewish, it's like, yeah, we invented the Sabbath, like we've been doing this for thousands of years.
Oh wow.
Yeah. And I see tweets sometimes that are like, what if we all just agreed not to use social media on Wednesday? And I'm like, nothing new under the sun.
You've invented this Sabbath.
Congrats, you've invented the Sabbath. Yeah, but so I wonder if we're going to see something similar to that, where okay, we invent this amazing new thing, but people want to kind of pull back from it a little bit. And there's so many advances in technology that we it's hard to predict what we're going to use them for. And AI is looking for cancer cells and all of these kind of medical implementations, where I'm kind of generally very excited for new technology, because I think there's a whole host of just like really boring things that you wouldn't think of, such as AI image recognition being used on cancer cells, and like training it on all the models of the MRIs or whatever. But yeah, I find it hard to really drum myself up to be super worried about points of no return or whatever. People who I used to live with or be friends with in San Francisco were always talking about this like singularity moment, but so far I've yet to really kind of get myself worked up over it.
Definitely. I think that makes a lot of sense. Well, Tommy, thank you so much for coming on. But before I let you go, this is a funny question, but you mentioned you really like mysteries and thrillers, and we're going to include a link to the great books and everything, but I'd love to get, do you have any recommendations?
Oh man. So the OG mystery, so there's a kind of trope in mysteries called a locked door mystery, where it's like, oh, you've got these group of people and one of them was murdered, but the door was locked. Yeah, exactly. And so Agatha Christie has two of these, one of which is Murder on the Orient Express, which, without giving it away, is about a murder on a train. And it's kind of a locked door mystery because the train gets stuck and like no one was able to get in, or you know what I mean? And so Murder on the Orient Express, which is a movie a couple of years ago with Kenneth Branagh, is actually an amazing book. It's really good. The second Agatha Christie is And Then There Were None, which is literally they're on an island and then there were none.
Nice.
Very, very descriptive titles. Recent ones, I thought Gone Girl was absolutely phenomenal, and I remember reading Gone Girl. I was at CCC, which is this kind of computer club conference, Congress thing in Germany in 2015. And I remember I was like at this conference, I had been looking forward to this conference for like months and months and months. And I literally kind of went to Germany for it and started Gone Girl on the plane there. And like literally the entire conference just passed me by. Yeah, because I was like just like in a corner reading Gone Girl to try and get it finished. So yeah, those are three really good recommendations. But I mean, in terms of recommendations, so my really nerdy achievement is that I've kept a list of every book I've read.
Oh, excellent.
For the last 11 years. Yeah, going on 12 years.
Awesome.
And so anything on that list that's bolded, I think is great. So if you're just like search for mysteries there.
Go check it out. Awesome. And so, where can people find the great books program you put together?
Yeah, so
Your blog.
TommyCollison.com. Yeah, TommyCollison.com/greatbooks is the kind of canonical list, and there people often ask me for translations or editions or whatever, and so
Yeah.
there's actually like ISBNs listed for if you want kind of editions that I enjoyed or whatever. Um, TommyCollison.com/books is that 11-year book list that I mentioned. And then, yeah, I wanted to just think about these ideas, not even from a career perspective of like, oh, look at this work I've done, but
Yeah.
literally just because like the most recent post is something like, I have thoughts about Dante's Inferno, and I'm like, okay, well, I'm gonna put them up on a blog and see what people think. And I've gotten some good emails about it where it's like, I think you're wrong because of like this, and I'm like, oh, okay.
That's awesome.
But yeah, that is literary.forge.blog. So literary.forge.blog. So yeah, anywhere there.
That's awesome. Well, thanks so much, Tommy. I really appreciate it.
Well, thanks so much for having me.